Druidry is a spirituality of embodiment, of saying, well, no, we're here for a reason, that our focus should not be on disengaging, but actually on engaging more deeply. So it's a sort of in and down and through and with kind of spirituality, saying we're here for a reason. And then why Druid, you might say? That there's a particular feature of Druidry which is really so interesting, which is that it combines an interest in art and nature.
In today's episode of the Mind Forest podcast, I head into the heart of the South Downs to meet Philip Carr Gomm. Philip is a psychologist, author, and perhaps most notably, a Druid. He spent over a decade as the leader of the largest order of British Druids, OBOD, and has spent his life working in the space between psychology and spirituality. He has pioneered the revival of modern Druidry and believes that rather than harking to the past, Druidry is a living, breathing spirituality that, whilst native to Britain, is interconnected with and rooted in humanity's ancient past, whilst ever growing and evolving. In today's episode, we speak about Druidry, the paradox of Englishness, Philip's recent work in the psychedelic field, and his new book, The Gift of the Night. I really enjoyed this chat with Philip, and it was so nice to be welcomed into his home and sit in his library amongst thousands of books. Druidry is a rather mysterious topic that's often misunderstood or misrepresented. I hope today's episode is a chance for you to learn more about this native British spirituality that is still living and breathing and growing today. Let's dive in. Philip Carr Gomm.
Charlie.
Welcome to the Mind Forest podcast.
Thank you. Hello.
How are you today?
I'm good. Good, thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, really, really good to see you, and thanks for coming on the show. I've been aware of your work for quite some years. I actually interviewed you back in 2018. We had a chat about ritual and mental health. So I'll leave a bit of an introduction for the viewers because there is so many aspects to what you do. But I guess what you're best known for is your role as the leader of the Bards, Ovates and Druids, as being one of the most prominent Druids in Great Britain. Now, I know this is a question you've probably been hit with many times, but for people who aren't aware of Druidry or only have a very kind of fleeting idea, well, one thing you've often said in interviews is there are as many ways to be a Druid as there are Druids, or maybe more. So I know it's quite an eclectic kind of spirituality, but perhaps could you let me know what are some of the underpinning themes of Druidry that flow through it?
Sure. Yes. Well, okay. I suppose the first one is it's a particular kind of perspective and approach, which you would call spiritual, a sort of spiritual approach to life that draws its inspiration from the ancient sort of pre-Christian world of the Druids, and has a recorded history of about 300 years, because of course the ancient Druids, it was an oral culture and tradition. So we've got some ideas about what they used to get up to in the old days, but then it was revived about 300 years ago, and then you've got 300 years of recorded history. So it's a cultural movement. It's a spiritual sort of world view that's based on a sort of understanding or belief that the earth is sacred, and that our spiritual lives shouldn't just be about seeking illumination for ourselves personally, but that somehow all of life is involved in this extraordinary enterprise of developing awareness and that probably sounds rather vague, but it's how does that strike you?
No, that strikes me well. I mean, I think one of the pieces I first pick up on is the connection to the natural world. Many of the kind of monotheistic theologies have perhaps a separation from the natural world, or certainly present us as guardians of it. Is the connection to the natural world then one of the main pieces? One
of the main things, and it's an embodied spirituality. In other words, it's not an up-and-out spirituality. Up-and-out spiritualities are about sort of seeking salvation or illumination, and then ideally not coming back, because the world can be a very tough place, and that's where suffering happens and so on. And so it's quite understandable that up-and-out religions and philosophies developed. But Druidry is a spirituality of embodiment, of saying, well, no, we're here for a reason, that our focus should not be on disengaging, but actually on engaging more deeply. So it's a sort of in and down and through and with kind of spirituality, saying we're here for a reason. And then why Druid, you might say? That there's a particular feature of Druidry which is really so interesting, which is that it combines an interest in art and nature. So it's a sort of earth religion or nature spirituality, if you like, drawing kind of inspiration from the natural world. But there's also this strong theme of the what's called the bardic tradition, which comes from way back, and this interest in poetry and art. And that's one of the reasons I find it particularly attractive, because it combines these two, this bardic tradition with a kind of natural philosophy and understanding.
Amazing. Yeah, I've always resonated with that bardic tradition. So the term Awen, I know, is quite synonymous with Druidry. Is that, am I right in thinking that's a term that reflects the creative focus of the spirituality?
Yes, well, it's a Welsh word meaning blessings or inspiration from the gods, flowing blessings, flowing inspiration. And it's really a way of talking, it's a term that denotes that experience that a lot of creative people have, which is that when they're being creative, it's coming from elsewhere. It's not coming from themselves. So you'll find songwriters and artists saying, well, it's as if I didn't really paint that or write that or compose that. Something seemed to happen. And psychologists talk about flow, the sense of flow. And sometimes you feel it as a sort of like a flowing sort of energy that comes through you. And Druidry sort of takes that seriously, if you like, and says, well, okay, what if it's coming from the divine source, if you like, and what if we can attract more of it into our lives? So a lot of the sort of the bardic training in Druidry is about how to attract Arwen, how to attract that creative flow into our lives.
Okay, so is the bardic tradition just, I've understood it as a written or a verbal, a very word-based tradition. Is it also visual? Could a painter be a bard too?
The reason you would think of it being associated with words, with the verbal tradition, because there's a strong emphasis in the bardic tradition on poetry and storytelling.
Right.
But there's also strong emphasis on music and song. And so it's not just confined to words, although that's understanding the kind of magical power of the word is a very important part of it, sure.
Right. I think there's a temptation from perhaps people who are being cynical or don't know much about modern Druidry to see it as a revivalist or a backwards looking movement. I'm sure you've been hit with this sort of thing many times, but I'm really aware that your work is about looking forwards, about bringing in sort of other inspirations. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey to sort of, I guess, modernising and reviving Druidry?
Yeah, that's a really important point, because an almost obvious reaction would be, hey, come on, we're in the 21st century. Why are you interested in something that, died out like over 1,000 years ago and was revived by a few people in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries? It seems peculiar. Well, the point is this. Inspiration isn't synonymous with novelty. So, and by that I mean it's very easy for us to think that to be inspired, we have to be inspired by the fresh and the new.
Yeah.
But we can also be inspired by something that's new. We can be inspired by Mozart. We can be inspired by something that's old. And I like to think of the story of the salmon life cycle, that the salmon swims upstream, upstream in order to spawn, goes back to where it was born, goes back to the source. And then it dies, and its body decays in the water, and the nutrients that brings to the water is what allows the young salmon fry to grow and then to go downstream.
Right.
And I think we've come to an age, at a sort of spiritually, if you like, where we need to go back. We need to go back to the sort of sources of our spirituality, and then to go through a process of transformation, of letting go and allowing something new to be born.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
I do, yeah.
And what I mean by that is what we see in the more established religions is that something that had its birth a long time ago, and then you've got layer after layer of interpretation and reinterpretation and commentary, and it gets kind of calcified. So that Christianity, for instance, today must be very different to how it felt in the very early days.
Definitely. Yeah.
So I think going back to the early times sounds regressive, but I think it's a key to rebirth, actually.
I guess it's the constant dichotomy of you need some sort of anchor, you need some sort of root to grow from, but then it seems like quite a fresh way of seeing the world, because like you say, there isn't that much written about the ancient Druids.
That's the paradox
Yeah.
in Druidry. It seems like it's really ancient, but because we lost most of it, it's actually quite fresh and new. So it's got this sort of rootedness in way back in the past, and is inspired by what we know of the ancient Druids and the old sites in the landscape and so on. But then actually it's up to us to actually bring new perspectives and new insights and inspiration. It's also interesting if you look at, if you see spiritual traditions as coming from a divine source, by definition that's outside of time. So you've got this flow of linear time.
Yeah.
And then, in this understanding, then outside of linear time and space, you have the divine, if you like, the one, the source. And then that sort of flows into time and into space. But a tradition is actually coming from a place out of time. So the fact that we're living now as opposed to 2,000 years ago doesn't actually make any difference, because we can connect with it as a living tradition now.
Interesting. Yeah, so is that how you see the Druidic tradition then, as rather than being something constructed from the ground up, it's something that was received from elsewhere, or is it a blend of both?
I think, some of its clothing, if you like, some of the colouring of the tradition comes from the sort of historical past. But actually, the life in it is coming from out of time. That's how I see it. It's very easy to see things as sort of something in a glass case in a museum. So you say, well, what is Druidism? Oh, well, it's that funny old thing they did before the coming of Christianity, and then some people revived it in the the 17th, 18th centuries and all that. But if you don't see it as that, as an objective thing, but you see it as a living, growing thing, then in a way you can see Druidry as having a life of its own that's probably more vibrant than it ever was in the past.
Amazing. Is becoming a Druid something that requires many years of learning, many years of initiation? What's the process?
It depends how you see it. So some people see it as they would use the term "I'm a Druid" as that's their favoured philosophy or worldview.
Yeah.
Just as you might have somebody say, "Oh, I'm a Buddhist," and what it means is that they've read some books on Buddhism. They like the ideas. They feel that's close. They feel very close and resonate with the ideas. So some people will say that, and then other people understand, or the same person might use it also in a different sense to mean somebody who's done a training, and they've trained to become a Druid, and then it's an initiatory path.
That makes sense. Something I've been curious about, you've spoken about how you had an interest in Eastern philosophy before you sort of circled back to what you might call British philosophy or spirituality. Are you aware of any influence from outside of Europe or the British Isles influencing the early Druids? Because it strikes me there are a lot of parallels between practices.
Absolutely, there are. We've got a whole project called the One Tree Project. There's the whole theory of Indo-European origins, which suggests that, and there are various sort of competing theories, but it seems likely that basically there was this movement, way back out of Africa, essentially, that went up to the sort of Caspian Sea area, and then people, flowed northwest up into Europe, and going as far as Ireland in the northwest, and then down into India. And then you had some sort of contra-flow movements as well. One of those flow movements is the Romany movement, for instance, where people came out of India and flowed back and ended up in Ireland and Romania. And, so there's some fascinating, when you start looking at the sort of genetic maps and how these influences flowed. And there are fascinating connections between Brahmanism, for instance, and Druidry. So yes, so we've engaged in a number of sort of conferences, and there's a whole section on our website on the Indo-European connection.
So this is the One Tree.
The One Tree Project, yeah.
Fascinating. Touching on that, I've got a few themes here that are very prevalent in the Dharmic traditions. I'm just going to throw some themes at you and hear your whether or not you think they have a place in Druidry. And having said that, I'm aware Druidry is very multifaceted, but just to get your view. So The macrocosm, microcosm, prevalent in Taoism, the idea that there is a small universe within you, there's the exterior universe, they're related. Does that play into Druidry?
Well, yes, this extraordinary way in which our own inner nature is not separate from, if you like, outer nature. That to discover the secrets of nature doesn't necessarily require us to go outside of ourselves, which is a fascinating process in itself, that since we ourselves are nature, if we go deep inside within, in our consciousness, nature is there too. And so even questions like the macrocosm and the microcosm start to sort of become irrelevant,
Right.
because it's all one, actually.
One other would be karma and rebirth. I've heard that that's something that's a lot of native spiritualities accept. Have you heard that as being a strand of Druidism?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the interesting things is there's very little we do know about the beliefs of the ancient Druids. But one of the things that the classical writers said that the Druids believed in was the transmigration of souls. And that's something that a lot of Buddhists, certainly Tibetan Buddhists do and so on, believe in that. Transmigration of souls is reincarnation, but with the sort of broader idea that you can also reincarnate as a tree or a rock or a river. That's interesting. So many Druids will believe that. And as regards karma, there's one of the classical writers tells a story of how fearless Celtic warriors were because they weren't afraid to die. And they would arrange loans based on a repayment in the next life. So you can always try asking your bank manager if you can repay your loan in another lifetime. See if he goes for it.
What about plant medicines?
One way of looking at Druidry is that it's a set of laws, Lores, plant law, herb law, weather law, stone law, star law, and tree law and so on. And so there's a whole body of plant law that we find, in all cultures. So there's material that Druids work with there in terms of, a lot of herbalists are very interested in Druidry. And again, the classical writers mention sort of 3 or 4 herbs that the Druids, the ancient Druids, worked with. But then we can extrapolate from that. We can look at what plants were growing at the time of the ancient Druids and what did the contemporaneous Roman writers say about the use of these plants, and then what did the Anglo-Saxon herbalists a few centuries later say about them, and so on, and then extrapolate from that what was almost certainly likely to be used by the ancient Druids. So we've done that in an oracle set that my partner Stephanie and I have created called the Druid Plant Oracle. One of the interesting things is that the psilocybin mushroom is found in these countries and in the Druid lands, as it were. And so then there's the obvious question: well, I wonder if they worked with them in the old days. And of course, again, we don't know. Like so much of ancient Druidry, we don't actually know. Do modern Druids do it? Well, some do, some don't. And I was talking with Dr. Andy Letcher, who's written a very interesting book about mushrooms called Shroom, and he was saying his perspective on it is that whilst the Druid world doesn't need the psychedelic world, in other words, it's functioning perfectly well in terms of exploring spirituality and being a spiritual path, he feels that the current psychedelic renaissance could benefit from Druidry. Which is it's saying a different thing, you see. So it's not saying that Druidry needs psychedelia, but it's saying psychedelia could perhaps benefit from Druidry in as much as it provides a sort of indigenous spiritual context in which people can approach these sacred substances.
There's a temptation in the West, and it's something that we've had to do, is to look elsewhere at other parts of the world for frameworks for plant medicines or for healing, because frankly we've had a lot of ours stripped away from us from thousands of years of religion and become a very sort of technology focused society. So I can really see how having a a framework closer to home could be really beneficial for people.
Absolutely. And I think that sense of inadequacy that we tend to have in this part of the world around our own spiritual traditions, which is why we look to other places.
There's almost I wouldn't want to say mockery, but there's almost a shame
There's
element.
a shame in it. There's a shame in it.
Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think it's very interesting. It's really salutary, actually, to study other spiritual approaches in some depth, because you discover. I mean, here's what I've discovered. For instance, if you study, say, shamanism in places like Russia and so on, or Jainism, very old dharmic religion in India, is you find that, and indeed the history of Christianity itself, you find something that at first sight appears very specific and defined and established, and and then you look at it and you discover that it's this funny patchwork that's been put together.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of controversies within it. There are disputes within it. There are people who challenge the authenticity. So you look at Jainism, which is thousands of years old, and you discover, oh, hang on a minute, that bit comes from Buddhism. Oh, that bit comes from a particular Hindu approach. And then there are people who challenge that and disagree with that, and likewise you'll say, say with what's happened in places like Russia, or is you discover that actually there's this extraordinary relationship where it turns out that somebody's grandmother studied theosophy, and that fed back into their particular approach and all the rest of it. So a part of the embarrassment and the shame comes from our particular sense that concerns around purity and authenticity. And that's a whole sort of topic in itself, the human search for purity. But it's actually a really dangerous search, which in its extreme leads to, as Ronald Hutton, the professor of history, says, leads to the smell of disinfectant and the sound of jackboots.
I think that might play into the wariness of not native, but European spirituality, is how it was bastardized by fascism.
By the Nazis. Absolutely. And there's a real concern of not wanting to go in that direction.
Yes.
But once one kind of accepts, I think for me that the most helpful sort of analogy is a river. And actually, there's the river has lots of tributaries, and every spiritual tradition, you can deconstruct Christianity in the same way, every aspect of it, from the Eucharist to the priest's vestments to the architecture of churches, there are all these influences coming from different places, from Judaism and so on. So everything is like each spiritual tradition is like a river with tributaries coming in, and it's being fed. And Druidry is the same. There's all sorts of influences flowing into it, and so there's a richness there. There isn't a purity there. You won't find a purity, and you don't actually want to find a purity, because you don't want pure water. You want water that's got minerals in it, and and so on. So it requires a readjustment, and then you can look at our indigenous, or the traditions in these lands, and say, oh my gosh, they're so rich. There's all this sort of pre-Christian stuff. There's this folklore. There's Christianity that's fed into it. And isn't this wonderful? This is rich and full.
For me personally, I think it can be really empowering when for people from this part of the world to understand we do have a native spirituality, but then have that deeper one tree perspective. Like you say, it does link back to all of the others. We're not separate. It's just knowing that you do have a home.
Yeah. It's exactly, and then that shame transforms into a kind of, pride's the wrong word, but a kind of
depth.
Joy, a depth. Yeah. It's a bit like on an individual level. I suppose you could have some analogy about how, when your sense of who you are, when you haven't deepened and broadened it, you can feel sort of slightly ashamed about sort of how inadequate you are or your family is, because and then you start to explore it and go deeper and wider. And which is why there's all those sort of programs of people exploring their ancestry is so sort of interesting, because people discover that, the story of my family actually is much more interesting than I thought it was, and it's plugged into something much wider, and
Obviously, we're in the British Isles, so the Druid tradition wouldn't have known the borders of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. But I think there's particularly something about Englishness where we are aware of the sort of colonial era of English history, and there is a shame there, and there is also a sort of I would say a coldness, or maybe even a dying sort of Christian tradition that many of us can't hang on to. So it creates this strange kind of sense of, like we said, homelessness in a spiritual sense. So I don't know, has Englishness, is that a topic that's kind of played on your mind much, being a Druid, when there would have been sort of people from Ireland or Scotland? How has Englishness played into it all?
That's interesting. I remember once doing a workshop in the States, and I was sort of late for my session, and I had sort of 30 people sitting in this room in this place, and I sort of ran to the auditorium, and a big woman barred my way and said, where do you come from? What are your roots? Like that. And it's almost like, I thought, if I say I'm English, she's going to bar my way and say, how dare you even talk about these things? And I remembered that, we have roots back into Scotland and all the rest of it. And so I said that. So she said, that's okay then. And sort of let me past. And so I've been aware of that. And I think there is, I think it's a really interesting question to ask, because English identity is peculiar. I mean, for a start, we're sitting here, and it's like, if you stop people in the street and you said, can you explain to me the difference between, being English, being British, coming from Great Britain and the British Isles and the United Kingdom? We've got these levels of identification. Like, are you from the UK? Are you from the British Isles? Are you British? Are you great? What's the difference between Great Britain and and people wouldn't be able to tell you. They wouldn't know. They couldn't nuance it and finesse it in that way. So for a start, there's a sort of vagueness there, and then there's the reality that from about the 11th century, at least, if not earlier, England was a sort of melting pot. There's fascinating information, about the incredible mix of people who were here at this time.
It's probably part of what made England so dynamic and strong. Really.
So dynamic and strong, and of course that, as you rightly say, the whole colonial story makes us feel really ashamed. And then you look across and you think, oh well, the Belgians have that too, Oh, and the French do as well, and then the Italians, and the Spanish. Oh God, the Portuguese. Oh yeah.
Not many people are innocent when you look into history. It's not detracting from the scale of what the British did.
It's not to excuse oneself at all, but it's like, it's not only us, and then you look at the movements of people, and you see. I mean, you learn stuff all the time. I learned something last weekend that I was walking up on the downland with an archaeologist, and I had always thought that we have these really bare hillsides because of sheep farming that came in, 16th, 17th century, and they were sort of stripped and all the rest of it. But he told me that happened in 3000 BC. It's like 3000 BC. The tribes came over from the Caspian, Anatolian area. They came over and they brought sheep with them. So for 5,000 years, those bare hillsides over there were bare. We ripped all the trees out and put sheep on them, which was extraordinary. And so, so it came from Anatolia. And then you look at the movements, say the Normans, and you think, oh, the French, they came. Oh, well, they weren't French. Originally, they came from the Nordic area. Oh, right, okay, it's the people from there. And then they came, and then they went, and then they went across into Britain. And then, as they drove some people out who came across from Cornwall and Wales, and they went across to Brittany. So the Bretons, they became Lesser Brittany. So actually, we've been moving around all the time, pushing one lot of people out, and there's no justification for it whatsoever. But it's just a fact of history.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reflects what you were saying about old religions. England has those similarities, and it's just like you can deconstruct any one point of it, and there'll be points of disagreement, but it's a real wormhole of a topic.
It is, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And when you were just talking about the bare hills, it got me reflecting on how looking closer to home again can be a healthy thing. Because another thing I think we do in the West is we look across to places like the Amazon and other rainforests, and rightly so, we decry the fact that they're being chopped down. But you look around England, we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. Our biodiversity is awful. and we talk about the green and pleasant land, but a lot of it is just bare grassland that has been overgrazed. We don't have much ancient forest left. So, maybe there's potential for Druidry, or certainly looking closer to home to rebuild some of our own nature too, because we have to play our part.
Exactly. And, luckily there's a tremendous kind of interest in rebuilding. You were talking about the rainforest. Again, the fact that I was reading the other day that in the South Downs you have a huge range of biodiversity that's just as much, if not more, than in the rainforest. Funnily enough.
Last couple of points on Druidry, but I've just got to get these two in. Do Druids believe in God?
The one of the interesting things about Druidry is how you can have a spiritual movement without dogma and without a fixed set of beliefs. It almost seems impossible that you could have that, but you actually have it with Druidry, and I think it's actually a fantastic feature of it. What I mean by that is you would think that in order to have a sort of cohesive movement, that you would have to have you'd have to have a theology, for instance, but there isn't one in Druidry. So if you had a gathering of Druids and you asked everybody in turn what their understanding of God or deity was, they'd all have different beliefs. So you'd have somebody might be a polytheist, believing in there are lots of gods. Then the next person would be a monotheist, who perhaps believes there's only one goddess. And then you might have an atheist, an atheist who says the concept of theism, of deity, just isn't sort of relevant to me. It doesn't work for me. I don't know what that means, and I can't grasp it. And then you have geotheists who believe that the creation is a result of a god and a goddess. And then agnostics who say, I don't know, don't ask me, how would I know? And yet all of them, I would say, have a kind of sense that this material reality that we see in front of us and we sense is not the only reality, that there's something more, and there's some sort of deeper meaning, that some context that we're held in, if you like, that we can call, for want of a better term, spiritual.
Amazing. Last thing on Druidry, I've seen an old video of the Queen or members of the royal family at Stonehenge. What's the link between the royal family and Druidry?
Yes, well, this is the interesting thing. When you imagine you're at a dinner party and somebody says they're a Druid, what you need to do is you need to establish what kind of Druid, because there are three kinds of Druid, right? So what they might be saying is that they're a member of a charitable organisation that has a history from the 18th century, rather like the Freemasons, rather like the Rotarians, who at their height had about 1 million members, and in between the wars, and included Winston Churchill as a member. And they had these sort of fraternal lodges, and men-only lodges, and then also female lodges too. And they still exist. There are probably a few thousand of them now left in Britain. It's a sort of dying thing, probably. And they would have meetings that would be fundraising for charities. So all very sort of laudable and all the rest of it, but not treating Druidry as a spiritual way at all. It's right. like So you'd have that. Then you'd have Druidry as a cultural phenomenon. You'd then have to ask your guest at the party, are you a member of the National Eisteddfod, which is where the Queen comes in, the royal family. So there's this tradition in Druidry, as I mentioned, the celebration of the arts. And in Wales, these celebrations are called Eisteddfodau, which is a festival of listening. And that's now established in the school system in Wales, so that they all have their sort of mini festivals, and it all leads up to the National Eisteddfod, which is a huge televised event every year, and it's probably the biggest cultural event in Europe. Actually, it goes on for days, and music, dance, song, etc., all in a celebration of Welsh culture and language. And the Queen was inducted into that's the film, the clip you've seen. I don't think it was at Stonehenge. I think it was in a stone circle in Wales. And I'm not sure if Prince Charles was inducted as well, or other members of the royal family, but certainly the Queen was.
So we're not sure if King Charles is a Druid or not.
We're not sure, but the Archbishop of Canterbury, there was Rowan Williams was inducted, and I remember the sort of BBC contacting me and sort of saying, what's your opinion on that, and I'm not sure whether Justin Welby, the current Archbishop, has become, but there's a wonderful photograph of Justin Welby in a Druid robe, smiling at the camera. So they, and again, their Druidry is cultural, and not as they don't treat Druidry as a sort of magical spiritual path. So you've got those two kind of Druids, but you might find your guest at the party is actually the third kind of Druid, which is the kind of Druidry that I work.
Best kind.
Well, who see Druidry as a magical spiritual way, and that's an interesting little point as well, because people can take Druidry in all sorts of ways. They can treat it as their religion. They can treat it as a sort of, almost like as a kind of historical, they're interested in the old stone circles and the old sites and the old ways from a sort of folkloric and historic point of view. They can sort of dive into Druidry for
like
that.
The Arthurian legends. And that
Yes,
sort of
yes,
stuff.
it's massive. It's just so rich, and then, but I think at its heart, Druidry, certainly in the way that the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids works in it, is as a spiritual, magical tradition. And by magic, this is what I mean. It's like we're used to spiritual traditions as being ways in which to help us achieve union with the divine. So they teach us, rituals and meditation techniques and so on that help us let go of our ego, if you like, and be absorbed in the divine. And that's the classic mystical quest. How can I become at one with deity, with the divine, with the source? And Druidry has that too, that aspect. But it also has another aspect, which is the magical. And by that I mean, instead of the desire to go up and in, up and out, up and to merge, to let go and merge and surrender to the divine, there's also, I think, a countervailing dynamic in the psyche, which wants to get engaged with life and wants to act in life, and that realizes that what you do is causative. You can really do good in the world and help people, and that's what I mean by the magical side of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a mythologist you may have heard of called Martin Shaw, who speaks about I heard him speak about the difference between soul and spirit, and it kind of touches on what you just said. He said, there's a place for both, and spirit is the high halls, the connection with the divine, the holy, and the soul is the roots, the earth, the mud, the muck, the depth. And he is of the belief that you don't have to have one or the other, but many people look more towards the spirit, but they lose a bit of depth and soul. And maybe Druidry is touching on that soul piece, that connection, that depth.
That's absolutely the transcendent, the up and out, right, is that transcendent spirit based aspect of spirituality. So and then the term I'm using is magical, but you could use soulful, for instance, the sort of the roots of the tree, and we want both ideally.
As well as your practice in Druidry, you've been a psychotherapist for many years. So how is your spirituality, your Druidry, how does that play into your therapeutic framework?
Yes. Well, I think really from an early age, actually, the topic that really interested me was that with the territory where psychology and spirituality meet, it's almost like where they overlap. It fascinates me, and so yes. So in the psychology I trained in, I did a conventional degree in psychology, and of course that's fabulous, and I love straightforward academic scientific psychology.
Yeah, there's still so much value to that. I don't think we can divorce from.
Can't no. But on its own, if you only sort of function in that world, there's a kind of ceiling that you sense, or a limitation. and that, bringing in the spiritual just becomes so interesting, which of course what Jung did, and then Assagioli, who developed psychosynthesis, did as well. And and although psychosynthesis is really important to me, I've sort of gone, like many people, I think they become quite eclectic. So I'm sort of quite eclectic. I think there's a value. I mean, the latest book I've done about insomnia, for instance, I use a lot of, inspiration from CBT, which is, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is coming out of behavioral psychology. And then saying, well, what happens if we get that and marry it with some spiritual input?
Yeah, it can't be one or the other. I remember when I studied psychology, it was kind of a two-way process. At the one hand, I was really blown away by how powerful it was to see the mind a bit like a computer, because it does mean that you can rearrange the code and improve things.
Yeah,
and there is a lot of powerful modalities, but yeah, it did seem to me a little bit like it wasn't the full picture, like it was a bit dry.
And that's so you have the sort of biopsychosocial approach, which is understandable, which is essentially saying, look, there are going to be biological reasons why you're feeling and acting in this way, and of course that's true, and then you've got the psycho, which is all the psychodynamic stuff, and it's also the way you were brought up and all those psychological dynamics. And then somebody rightly says, yes, but there are also social dynamics as well, because if you're in this context, that's going to be. But then I think we need a model that's biopsychosocial and then eco, because there does happen to be the rest of the world too, the more than human.
Well, that's the problem with the kind of existentialism and just seeing yourself as divorced from.
It's very anthropocentric sort of psychology. Yeah, that's right. So you bring in the influence of nature, which, and it's great that scientific psychology is starting to really study that now and look at the influence of trees and the weather and the seasons on our psyche and all the rest of it. So and then spiritually, so you need really a biopsychosocial, eco-spiritual approach, and that sort of holistic approach is what interests me.
So when you're presented with a client, are you actively? I know you'll be actively listening as a given, but are you scanning for where perhaps, if we imagine those approaches you just gave are like, if you imagine a circle and there's kind of lines coming out, are you kind of listening to a client and thinking, okay, here's a social issue, let me give a social approach, it might be more spiritual, so it's just like more tools in your toolkit to help people?
Well, yeah, I think if you when you have a client and you're encountering somebody, and if you have that perspective or that way of looking at how come a person might be going through these particular difficulties, and you're thinking, could it be biological? Could something biological be happening here? Could something psychodynamic? Could there be social influences and so on? And so yes, or is this some challenge that's coming from a deeper level, some kind of soul level, or a combination of all of them, and I think that's one of the reasons why in the last few years sleep has become of interest to me.
Right.
Because on the one, because all those factors come into play, and because sleep is so fundamental and it has this bi-directional relationship with somebody's psychological health, and by that I mean, if somebody's suffering from anxiety or depression, and they come to see you, if you find out about how their sleep is doing, you'll find that if they're not getting the right kind of sleep, enough sleep, that's going to be influencing how they're feeling, and vice versa, and it's going to be going both ways. And then you can start to work at both levels. You can make suggestions at a biological level, if you like. In other words, changes they can make at a physical level that is going to improve their chances of getting a better night's sleep. And that in itself will improve their mood and their mental health. And then you can also look at other factors too.
What are some of the other lenses you use then to help people sleep?
Okay. Well, so the approach that I take is the fact that sleep science is really very well developed and isn't very controversial. In other words, in many fields in psychology and in medicine too, probably there are lots of competing opinions about approaches, but in sleep science, there's this particular body of evidence, and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the sort of recommended approach in the sort of medical community, has a very high success rate, about 70%. So that's unusual again with a particular high success rate, discrete body of understanding around it. And then I thought, what if we take that, we look at that and use that, make use of it, but also make use of this a whole lot of stuff that doesn't have the evidence base for it, because to create an evidence base you need a lot of money and a lot of time, and it just hasn't been. So for things like hypnotherapy and sophrology, which I've trained in, and yoga nidra and approaches like that are coming out of sort of alternative approaches and spiritual approaches like yoga nidra. What happens? But thousands of people swear by them, and I personally found them helpful because, like you, I went through a bout of insomnia, and it's horrible, and so what happens if we put the two together? So that's what you'd call an integrative approach. Right. So that's the first sort of lens, if you like. Then the other lens that I use is a psychedelic therapy one.
Okay.
And it's really simple, and it goes like this. In psychedelic therapy, you apply this concept that Leary and Alpert, those two Harvard psychologists way back 50 years ago or so, developed, which was setting, and medicine, which is, they say, to have a successful trip, you need to have the right mindset and heart set, if you like, the right approach to it, and then the right setting. And then medicine is like, what are you taking and how much of it? Terribly important. All right. So the insight I had really, which was when I was working in the psychedelic therapy field, is I thought, hang on a minute, going to sleep it's the same process. We're trying to help people move from an ordinary state of consciousness to an extraordinary state of consciousness and back again safely and effectively. We're trying to help that process.
Move through the boundaries, shift to this very strange state of having dreams and all the rest of it. And what if we talk about sleep in the same way, which is you get your set mindset right, which is how you think about sleep, which is called cognitive restructuring in the. Yeah, I think that's where I've stumbled in the past. I've put sleep on a pedestal as something to be achieved.
Yeah.
And then I actually realised one of the keys to sleeping well is to not try and sleep. It's a paradox.
The paradox
comes when you're not looking for it. Get all the physical stuff right, and then don't care about it.
And then don't care about it. Absolutely. Just let go.
Does that reflect your...
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's right. Okay, that's right. Yes. Because otherwise you start worrying about it, and then because you know that worry isn't good for you, you worry about the fact that you're worrying. So you double worry.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so you've got that piece.
So there's that piece there. So you get that all that right, and how you feel and think about it, and then you get all the setting stuff. And this is what's called in CBT and in medicine sleep hygiene, which I think is a terrible term. I mean, it suggests when you go and see the doctor or the therapist, they talk about sleep, it suggests that somehow you've been sleeping unhygienically, that you're a bit grubby in some way.
Yeah, that gives me an image of like being in a lab coat or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Start scrubbing your bedroom with disinfectant. Sleep hygiene. What they mean by sleep hygiene is the setting. In other words, your bedding, the lighting, the temperature, all these very basic things, not using blue light, from screens in the evening, getting all those practical things sorted, which is obvious at one level, but it's not obvious when you talk to clients. I mean, I've had people, clients who I've worked with in sleep therapy with, who've said things like, "Oh well, yeah, ever since my husband left, I've had to move flat, and I've got a lot of furniture on the bed. It's okay, it's a double bed, so I've got a coffee table and a couple of chairs on one side of the bed, and I do have 6 cats, who sleep with me,
You start unpicking it.
And you start unpicking it. You think, oh, why are you doing this? And so you get all that right. And then you're ready to go, because essentially to sleep well, you need the right circumstances, a safe, dark, quiet bedroom, and you need a relaxed mind and body. Relaxed mind and body, that's a whole issue in itself, and that's we can talk about that. But when you've got to that state and you're lying in bed, it's how are you going to drift off? And I've identified sort of 13 ways of doing that.
Amazing. And
in my book and the audiobook that goes with it, and the sort of online course that I do on it, I basically run through the 13 methods. Amazing. And you sort of take your pick, really. You choose the one that works for you.
So that's the focus of the book then. It sounds very practical, which I like.
It's very practical.
It sounds like it's not allegorical or anything. You're actually giving people advice.
Yeah,
Based on your experience.
I've developed a 6-step program that I've been teaching people for about 3 years now.
Love it.
And the book is called The Gift of the Night, and it's based on the concept that we're all tend to be so stressed and lead such busy lives. And we all want me time, that thing of like, oh, if only I could have some time, how can I get away and just stop?
And then you get me time, and all you think about is other things.
Well, you actually get 8 hours of me time a night. Yeah. Suddenly it's just you and the bed, or maybe there's somebody next to you, who knows? But basically you've got 8 hours of me time. And so this is where I part company with CBT. They tell you to get out of bed if you haven't gone to sleep within 10 to 15 minutes. So you lie there, and they tell you not to worry about it. But how hard is it, or how easy is it to not think?
Just don't worry.
Hang on a minute. It must have been here at least 10 minutes.
Looking at the time's got to be the worst.
Nuts.
The worst thing you can do.
But people do it, and it can work. But they're trying to develop a pairing between bed, sleep. So your brain is going, bed, sleep, like a Pavlovian dog that's salivating. Bed, sleep.
No, okay, I can see that.
You can see
so
that.
Don't do anything else in your bed. Don't eat.
Yes,
in your
well,
bed.
this is
Don't
where
sit on
you
your
get
laptop
to the
and
dark
watch
little
videos about Druidry for 6 hours.
Don't. Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Don't watch videos. Don't read books.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. But there is a dark little, well, not dark little secret. That's a dramatic way of saying it. But there's a real problem with that approach, which is that they tell you to the bedroom should only, don't do any of those things. All you can do in the bedroom is sleep and sex. And you say, well, hang on a minute. Sex isn't soporific, or it shouldn't be, certainly. It's quite exciting, isn't it? And that you're pairing. Your brain isn't going, bed, sleep. It's going, bed, excitement, sleep, excitement.
I
bed.
see. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I pointed this out to a CBT specialist, and he said, "Well, yes, I'm afraid you've stumbled on the exactly a problem we have, which is so some CBT purists say don't even do sex in the bedroom. Use the kitchen. Don't don't use the bedroom because it's got to be. But my point is that yes, behavioral psychology is right. We are creatures of instinct. Who work with stimulus and response, but we're also souls. We're also spiritual beings, and we can use the bedroom for spiritual retreats. I mean, if I showed you around this house and I said, do you know something, Charlie, we've got a room dedicated to changing consciousness. And you'd say, what? Yes, there's a whole room that is dedicated to changing consciousness. And you say, what do you mean? And you sort of imagine that, I've got a little sort of temple or something. And I open the door and it's the bedroom. Because that I use that room to change consciousness.
That's a really nice frame, because it sees sleep as something enjoyable.
It's a retreat time. It's a retreat space. And you don't have to be snoring in there. You can be meditating. You can be drifting. You can just let go of trying to get to sleep, and that's your retreat time every night. That's the gift of the night.
Love it. Can't wait to read that. Last thing on sleep that's really helped me is enjoying my getting back into dreaming and enjoying my dreams, and almost like telling myself a little story as I drift off, and then that almost becomes the dream.
Yeah.
Is dream analysis something you've used much in your practice?
Sometimes it's something that comes up. It's not the sort of the basis of what I do, but if people recount interesting dreams or dreams they feel are significant, then we go in that direction. Yeah.
Do you have a model for that? Do you tend to see that people's own interpretation will be the baseline for analysing a dream?
I think so much that the client or the person you're working with, deep down, they sort of, they know there's this, I really believe that the soul, if you like, or deep down, we sort of know, we have access to a source of knowledge, all that we need to know. And that if you provide the setting, you provide the right setting for something, the right context, and you sort of encourage that kind of that access for that person, then they themselves will be able. That's how I work with the tarot as well, because I've created with colleagues a couple of tarot decks.
So you see the tarot as more of a self-reflection rather than, if you got the king it means this.
Well, exactly. A lot of tarot readers will sort of take the position of power, and you will come with your problem, if you like, and say, I need some help. And then I, as the expert, tell you what the cards say. But I flip that around and invite the person to select some cards and to look at them and then see the images as part of a story coming out and just to talk. And about 90% of people, if you do the setup right, if you set it up right, they will give their own reading. They'll say, "Oh, that's just like my mum and dad are there, and I can see how I'm over to the side there, and and I'm looking sad because and they go into it, and then your role as the therapist, if you like, or the tarot reader, is just to make little hints and say, what happens if you move that card a little closer? Or I've had people burst into tears by inviting them to move a card closer to another card. Very powerful.
Right. Interesting. So really it's just a tool. It's a tool for exploring different themes rather than saying there's some sort of divine magic here that's dictating which tarot card you get.
Because that's very disempowering. You see, the way that I feel that the way that I do it is empowering because whereas if I'm sitting there as the expert telling them like it is, then that's disempowering, and that can actually foster or make the problem even deeper, dig it deeper.
Although ironically, a lot of reductionist materialists are determinists. Yes. And if you were a determinist, then necessarily you would believe that the tarot cards are determined for you.
Yes.
So there you go.
Yes, there's a little one there.
Think about. So you, through your work with Druidry and sleep, you seem to have stumbled onto this kind of psychedelic or plant medicine renaissance, and I can really feel from you that's like a new passion and something you're really enjoying. Can you just tell me how that came about and like what's going on with that?
That came about when I retired after 32 years of being the leader of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. I retired and handed the job over to a lovely lady, Emma Burke, who's also a psychologist from in Ireland, and no sooner had I closed that door, as they say, that saying, when one door closes, another one opens. Yeah. About a month or 2 months later, a lady called Dr. Ros Watts came to see me because she wanted me to join her on a team. She invited me to join her on a team working with clients from the Imperial College trial on treatment-resistant depression, where they'd taken psilocybin. And so for the last 3 years, I've been working in that field, basically.
Amazing. So what does your work involve? Is that from a therapeutic lens? Are you sort of guiding people through their sessions? Are you providing an overview?
Well, it's changed over the last few years. So I started off, we ran a support group for the participants in the clinical trials, the Imperial College trials, for about a year. And Ros had developed a way of working with integration, because there's this important work, the integration work. I mean, that after you've had these extraordinary experiences, you of course, what happens is you drop back into the same life, same relationship, same job, all the rest of it. And people need help adjusting and integrating these kind of great influxes of insight and feeling into their lives. And she had developed a way of working using the trees from the Gomm tree calendar, which is the sort of tree language. Some people call it the tree language of the Druids, which is why she contacted me, because she thought, there's somebody who's interested in Druidry and is a psychologist as well.
Okay, so she began using the Gomm as a sort of reflection tool after the experience.
Yes. So that what we did is we held, and this was all during the time of the pandemic. Right. So it's all this was going on, online. Doing workshops, sort of 2-3 hour workshops, working with the trees, doing meditations, having sharing circles, and using the different qualities of the trees as we went around the year's calendar to develop and strengthen various aspects of ourselves and integrate the experiences. And then at some point during that year and a half, I was invited to work in an online training program for people training in this, who wanted to train in this new field of psychedelic therapy, and then I was asked to join the retreat team, where we were doing ceremonies with with small groups of people, sort of 15 to 20 people, and in beautiful sort of centres in Holland, in natural settings, and so that's the experience in sort of three different areas within this field. Yeah.
It is very exciting. It is a new field, but I'm sure there also needs to be framework and caution. What are some of your reflections, just being early on in this field? What are some reflections you've had from the process of working with psilocybin and people with depression?
Yes, that's interesting. Well, I think what's happened is it's a fast changing field, and in these few years that I've been involved in it, there's this, because it's illegal in most countries. But various places like Oregon in the States are opening up to it being licensed for therapists to work with it therapeutically and so on, and there's what we saw was a huge influx of venture capital into these companies, and then various companies going bust, and that kind of rather unseemly scramble that we humans tend to get when we perfectly sort of well motivated. It's like, particularly depression is so pervasive these days, and anxiety, and so people's desire to be relieved of this is so strong, and the potential is so great actually with these substances, that it's perfectly natural that people should scramble to capitalize on this. But then you have the problem of capitalizing on it with all the issues you can imagine, which are there, people trying to develop patents and muscle out the competition and so on. So that's another whole topic. So there's it's been interesting to observe that, and to perhaps one of the benefits of age is that you've seen things come and go, and you're not going to get carried away perhaps so much as one might when one was younger. So when, for instance, one of the companies that I worked for collapsed in a sort of dramatic fashion, because they just overstretched basically.
Classic.
Yes, at one level I wasn't surprised, But I think there's tremendous potential in it, and it's as I mentioned earlier with Andy Letcher coming up with this concept of that. I think this very simple formula of set and setting being so important, and I think actually Druidry can provide a context for people in that field that brings more safety into it and brings a kind of a capacity to hold the experience. So I think there is potential there.
I think it's really exciting, and for what it's worth, I think it's really encouraging that figures like yourself are involved in it and are providing those frameworks for people to come out of those experiences and, like you say, have something to hold them. Well, Philip, it's been a really fascinating chat. It's gone from Druidry to sleep to plant medicine, but for what it's worth, I've gained a lot of value reading your books, learning from your work, and I think a lot of the work you've done will be seen as very important in years to come, actually, as there are revivals in these movements. Yes, I think you've been a little bit ahead of your time in some of this stuff. So for what it's worth, thank you for all the work you've done.
Well, thank you.
And thanks for your time today. It's a pleasure to meet you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Charlie.